So we have Mike Berners-Lee, who has written the Sustainability Handbook that everyone must read. This is his book, and he's going to be here today to share with us some of his thoughts from his book. So let's welcome him now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and it's fantastic to be here at this place where there's so much kind of new thinking about everything that's going on, because that's absolutely what we need. And it's going to be a great, very healthy challenge for me today as well, to go and do a talk without being protected by a slide deck of about 50 slides that tell me exactly what I'm supposed to say next. So I'm sure it's very good for me. So I've been working around climate change for about 15 years or so now. And it's inescapably clear that if you want to deal with climate change, actually you have to see it as a symptom of something much, much bigger that's going on. And it's not just climate change. We talk about climate change a lot, but biodiversity is as serious a crisis, and there are other environmental crises going on. And if we were to find a climate change-shaped sticky plaster to put over the way that we do life at the moment, that kind of fixed that one just about, it doesn't take much imagination to see that it won't be long before we were in trouble over a whole load of other things at the same time. So, what is this bigger thing that's going on that climate change is just a symptom of? And some people use this big word for it, the Anthropocene. But one way of looking at it is just to say humans have been using more and more energy every year, more or less, for millennia. We've been getting to be a more powerful species. We've been inventing more efficient ways of doing things. We've been innovating. We've been creating technologies. And our appetite for growth has always been there. And we've been able to have a bigger energy supply and able to extract more resources and so on. And for millennia, that didn't matter, because we could get away with treating the world as if it was a big playground that was robust to everything we could do. And that's been the case, really, until pretty recently. So 100 years ago, we couldn't smash the whole place up even if we tried, and we did try pretty hard. Then over the next 50 years, we got about 3 times as much energy supplied at our disposal, and we invented a lot of different things to do with it, including nuclear weapons and so on. And we realized, kind of with a shock, that we could smash the whole place up if we did something really stupid. Well, 50 years on from then, we don't have to be really stupid anymore. We just have to be not really careful, and we'll smash the place up. We can and we are smashing the place up at high speed. So the big thing that's hitting us right now, it's not brand new that we've hit the Anthropocene, but it's brand new that we've hit the point at which, if we don't pretend as if we're not in the Anthropocene, we are going to get into catastrophic trouble, in a really short space of time. And actually, we don't really know how. I'm not trying to be doom and gloomy. People tell me it's an optimistic book, by the way. Depends on what your start point is, I think. But we don't actually know how. We talk about climate change sometimes as if we can stay within 1.5 degrees, then it will definitely be fine, and we'll be in trouble if we don't, and so on. Actually, the truth of it is, we don't know how much trouble we're in. We don't know whether it's already too late to contain climate change to the point where it's only catastrophic for millions of people rather than billions. We don't know whether 1.5 will be okay for that or not. We don't even know whether we might. It's just conceivable we could stretch it out to 2 degrees. It looks pretty unlikely. But we do know that there's enormous risk, and we know that it looks like, as far as we can tell, there is absolutely everything to play for. But what's required is a huge, big systemic change. Because we're in a situation now in which it's not just climate change. There's a whole load of, in terms of the physical things we need to get on top of, there's biodiversity, there's the climate emergency. At the same time, we need to feed everybody with a growing population. And somehow we need to figure out how to do a renewable energy supply. And meanwhile, we're filling the world full of plastics and other pollutants that are causing us all kinds of strife. So that's just some of the physical challenges that we need to deal with. And And it doesn't work to deal with them one at a time. You have to look at them all together. And I'll tell you the good news about this, because the first half or so of the book is mainly about these kind of physical challenges that we need to deal with. And that the one-liner on it is that from a technical and scientific perspective, it looks like they're all brilliantly solvable, actually. More or less, there's plenty of challenge in there, and there's plenty of devil in the detail that we need to sort out. But turns out that they're broadly speaking solvable. So that takes us into the real question of what we need to the other stuff we need to be looked at is what would it take for humans to be solving these technically solvable challenges? And that straight away takes you into questions of economics, how businesses work, how we think about technology, our whole relationship with technology, questions of inequality that we've always sort of, in a way, had on the back burner, but now maybe that's absolutely inescapable, that we have to deal with inequality. Otherwise, we just can't thrive in this Anthropocene. Questions of how we do information, how we share information, how we work out what to trust when it's harder than ever to do that. Questions of politics, questions of decision-making and problem-solving. So all these things kind of jumbled up together. And it does, as I say, it doesn't work to look at things one at a time. You have to look at it all together. So that's why when I wrote No Planet B, it's kind of my unashamed attempt to try and do the big picture of everything through the lens of every discipline you can think of, all in one go, in a way that is robust but still chatty, deadly serious but still fun in places. It's just kind of trying to do everything, because I actually think that that is the kind of thinking we need to do, really big picture, multidisciplinary, accessible thinking. And it's not intended as an end point, it's a start point. It's intended to be something that obviously that we evolve as we go. And then kind of towards the end of the book, everything I've discussed so far takes you inescapably into questions, I think, about actually the way that humans think and some thinking skills and habits that we need to develop and get much better of immediately at high speed, like a rapid rebalancing of evolution. We're technically brilliant, and now that we're technically brilliant, we need some other skills as well to enable us to be, to raise the game on our stewardship of this one beautiful little fragile planet A that we're on at high speed. And possibly the crunch point of the whole book is, and it's amazing, in the course of writing it, I talked to lots of scientists, I talked to lots of technical experts in all sorts of areas, and it's amazing how many of them would say to me, at the end of a sort of long cup of coffee, chewing the fat over everything, would say to me words that kind of reflected where I was coming from as well, words to the effect of, well, you know what, at the end of the day, perhaps it all comes down to a values debate. Perhaps it's all down to the values that we've got. And if we can have a certain set of values, then humans are able to thrive in the Anthropocene. And if we can't have these values, then whatever we do, we just won't be able to make it work. And so that's kind of, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So I'm just going to give a very quick tour of some of the things, just snippets of some of the things that are in the book. And it finishes, it's designed to be practical, so it's not just what should happen, but it's, well, what could I do about it? So I'll have a few moments to just touch on that at the end, and then take, hopefully, lots of questions. So, just a few things. I'll start by saying a couple of things on the climate emergency. There is an appendix at the back with 14 things that I think everybody needs to know about the climate emergency, and with a request that if you do have a choice, you never ever vote for anybody who doesn't get all these 14 things and take them all seriously. So a little checklist for you. But the biggest thing I want to say about it is that if you look at the carbon curve, emissions against time, it's going up like that, and there is not the faintest trace of evidence that humans have noticed climate change. Right? If you look at it, it's going up exactly, and I am choosing my words carefully, exactly as we might have predicted it would have done if humans had never noticed that climate change might be an issue we need to think about. So all the Paris talks and the national targets, and I'm sure this tent is full of people, like me included, who try to do things to cut their carbon footprint and so on, but for some reason it's getting us absolutely, so far it's got us absolutely nowhere at all. And I'm not saying this to be depressing. I'm saying this because noticing that tells us a great deal about the kinds of things that won't help us get on top of the problem and the kinds of things that will. It tells us that what we've got on our hands is a big systemic challenge, and we need to interrupt it at the global system level. So one way and another, we need and it doesn't matter how hard you think it is to achieve this, we need a global arrangement to leave the world's fossil fuels in the ground. And so anyone who wants to be part of the solution to this needs to ask the question, well, all right then, what could I do to help create the conditions under which the world might be capable of coming to such an arrangement? And because at the moment the way it works is that if you take, it's a bit like a balloon squeezing effect, or some people call it the rebound effect, or various different expressions for it. But if you squeeze the balloon in one place, if one part of the world cuts its carbon, or one person cuts their carbon, the awful reality is that the way the whole system dynamics of it works is that the rest of the system's just compensating for it. And so we need to interrupt those dynamics of growth at the global system level. So somehow just one thing to say about energy, and I say this because the energy sector at the moment is talking about, the oil companies are talking about, we need 1.5. It's so important, and at the same time, how are we going to reach 1.5 degrees whilst we grow our energy supply as we need to? And so the thing I just want to say really, really clearly is that the world needs to use less energy, not more, and there's no escaping that. We're already foot to the floor, flat out, transitioning today's energy supply without growing it at all. And at the moment, it's growing at 2.4% a year, which is a factor of 10 every century, and we absolutely have to stop growing that energy supply. And the second thing to say is that efficiency improvements on their own don't do anything to help with that. But what happens with an efficiency improvement, if you don't do something to make sure you're bagging the savings, like agreeing to leave the world's fossil fuel in the ground, what happens with an efficiency improvement is it actually increases your capacity to do stuff even more than the efficiency improvement would allow you to do. So your resource extraction and your impact actually goes up a bit, not down. And the whole of the tech industry needs to get its head around that. So just quickly, a couple of things on food. We did a lot of mapping of the first 40 pages are all about the food system, the food and land system. And some good news, we did a mapping of the world's nutrition from the field to the fork and other outputs. And the really good news is that if you look at the calories we produce, but you can do this we did this analysis for every nutrient that you need, protein, iron, zinc, everything. It turns out we grow tons of it. We grow at the global level 6,000 calories per person per day, about 2.5 times what we need, and similar for protein. So what happens to it? Well, we lose some in various forms of waste, including household waste, which is a lot in this country, but not much in Africa, storage waste, harvest losses, all kinds of bits of losses along the way. And it goes without saying we need to cut those down a bit, as much as we can. And about 800 calories per person per day at the global level gets sent to non-food uses. That's things like plastics, but even more than that, it's biofuel. And biofuel's not bad as such, but just to lay out the dangers of biofuel, if you had enough wheat to feed me for a day, or at least give me the calories I needed for a day, but instead you put that wheat towards biofuel and you tried to drive my little Citroen C1 1-litre engine car, you could drive that car for 1 mile. Okay, so that's a day's worth of food against 1 mile in a car. That's an incredibly steep trade-off. You can do things to improve that a little bit, but only by maybe a factor of 5. So it's still an incredibly steep trade-off. So we need to watch if the low-carbon world can't be reached through biofuel instead of fossil fuel. Then the next thing to say about the food system, the two biggest things that strike you from this sort of mapping out of where all the nutrition goes, is that we are feeding to farm animals at the global level about 1,750 calories of human edible food to farm animals. And farm animals, they're eating that. They're also eating a lot of grass, pasture, and stover. And they're giving us back about 600 calories in in meat and dairy, and a similar level of, and in a similar way, they're destroying protein as well and all the other nutrients you can think of. So if we could just stop feeding human edible food to farm animals, we would liberate so much capacity in the food and land system to sort out our biodiversity, deal with climate change, and feed a rising population. So it's just a kind of there's no escaping it. It's the single biggest thing that we need to do. And the good news is it's entirely consistent with health and tasty food and all the rest of it. There's actually no intrinsic reason why we can't just get on and make the change, however culturally difficult that feels. But maybe the biggest thing that struck us when we did this analysis was that actually, you know what, there's plenty of food, so why do some people go malnourished? And you could double the food supply, some people would still be going malnourished. It boils down to, in the market economy, it boils down to, does the supply chain bother to find its way to every village in the world? And in the market economy, that boils down to, does every village in the world have enough money for the supply chain to want to bother to find its way there? And if we don't do something about that, then we're always going to have some people who don't have enough. Okay, so that's a snippet of some of the kind of physical challenges, and on into some of the why don't we solve all these things? So straight away, of course, into economics. And here we are, we've got this, and it's unsurprising. Now we're in this Anthropocene, we've got this completely different context for humanity to be operating in. It's unsurprising that lots of the ways that we do life that have been honed in the millennia up until now suddenly may not be fit for purpose. So the real challenge is to identify them immediately and even more challenging to make the change. And I won't talk a lot about economics here, but just to say, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room, this tent who get this, but the whole thing about growth, we are on a finite planet. We have to choose very carefully the things that we try to grow in the future. So one of the things we can try and grow is our capacity for human empathy. So we get better at tuning in at the emotional level to things that affect people's lives on the other side of the planet, who we're never going to meet. Because, like it or not now, we are one tribe in one sense, and we have to treat each other with an equal respect. So there are some things we absolutely have to try and grow our capacity for. Our imagination we have to try and grow our capacity for. Our ability to do big picture thinking. We have to try and grow our biodiversity. So it's not as though we can't aspire. It's just we need to completely change the flavor of our growth away from energy and GDP, which needs to become an irrelevant metric. If we're going to have metrics, we need to have metrics which are relevant to human well-being, and we also need to treat all our metrics with, put them all in perspective. Numbers can tell us some things really usefully, but they can't tell us everything. And we need to stand back for them and say, you know what matters about people and planet is not just metrics. There's some other stuff as well. Inequality that we've always kind of, in a way, in this country, in the developed world, we've always put inequality a bit on the back burner and put up with huge levels of inequality around the world. But if you ask yourself the question, what would it take? If you really ask, what will it take for the world to be able to come to an agreement to leave that fossil fuel in the ground, just for example, then it's pretty hard to imagine how that will be possible without starting to do a whole sort of treatment of how the people around the world in a way that says, okay, so we're on the same side, and we begin to trust each other because there's a sense of fair play going on, and we're dealing with that inequality. Just snippets. So media and politics and so on. So the complexity of what we have to deal with here is bigger than we've ever had before, and we need the clearest view of it than we've ever had before. And yet, because of that complexity, it's ever easier to be confused by it. And for people to deliberately pull the wool over our eyes. So we need to get much, much hotter at discerning fact from fiction and taking action when we're not when anybody is being careless with the facts with us. So we've kind of, we've seen progress in the wrong direction of late, and we need to absolutely turn that round and somehow find the mechanisms by which we hold our media to account and we hold our politicians to account, and we bring about a world in which actually, your credibility as a politician is absolutely and totally on the line if you are found to be careless with the truth about anything. So I was did a talk for the Conservatives Association the other day. I was really looking forward to it, but I was imploring them, whoever you vote for, just ask yourself carefully, do they have a track record of telling the truth? Ha ha. Actually, they sort of got it, or they nodded in the right way. And then on to questions of problem solving and decision making. So we've got these habits of solving problems and doing decision making. And, they are not proving adequate. In our democracy, we hold it up as this fantastic thing. But the people from Extinction Rebellion yesterday were brilliant on this. We need to improve the quality of our decision making and improve the quality of our democracy. And some of these experiments in things like citizens' assemblies and juries are, at the very least, really hopeful experiments in just improving the quality with which we make decisions around these complex and interconnected things that all need to be thought through at once. So I said I'd talk about values and the sort of crunch point of the book in some ways. So, I identify just very simply 3 values which, if we can make them prevalent in global society, then we stand a chance, and if we can't, then we're going to be in trouble whatever we do. And the good news is that it is possible to cultivate these values through deliberate human effort. And there's plenty of research on that from all sorts of fields. And they're just really, really simple. The first is to respect truth for its own sake, whatever it is, however convenient or inconvenient it is, and to really hold on to that and be discerning and critical about that. And the second thing is to respect each other as everybody, as having equal inherent value as a human being, whoever you are, wherever you come from in the world, however rich you are, even whatever you've done, actually. And that sounds almost so simple, surely that's so obvious, why bother mentioning it? But if we even began to live that way, it would have huge implications. And the final one is to extend that respect to all the species, all the other species in the world, not just as servants of humanity, but in their own right. And I think I'll just to start talking about Extinction Rebellion, because my book I just finished the final edits just as Extinction Rebellion was becoming, was coming onto the radar, and after the book was published, I wasn't quite sure what I'd make of how they'd play their cards and so on. I spent a few days going around the protests in April, and I've got to say, I was incredibly impressed. And one of the things I was impressed by particularly was, those 3 values that I've just talked about, they are absolutely insistent on. The way that they insist on respect for absolutely everybody in all situations, I think is brilliant. And their insistence on truth, also absolutely brilliant. And there's one thing I'd call for, is for them to widen that out. So, because actually we need truth not just about climate emergency and biodiversity. We need truth about absolutely everything. We need a situation in which, the standards of truthfulness are just really, really high. So I'm going to stop talking in a sec, but people ask me, and it's a really, really important question, when all the problems we've got are so global and systemic, is there anything meaningful that an individual can do? And I think it's a fair question, because there are big systemic questions. And the question is, the way to answer it, it turns out there's plenty we can all do. And it's about asking the question, what can I do to help create the conditions under which the world is able to make the big system transformation that we need, that includes but is absolutely by no means limited to an agreement to leave the fossil fuel in the ground. And I think it boils down, the first thing is about imagining. We need to get much better and stronger at imagining how much better the world could be, because it's only us that stops us from living far better than we do. And also imagining, truthfully, how much worse the world is going to get in a short space of time if we don't get on the case. So we have a strong sense of the difference between if we make this transition and if we don't. That's the first thing. The second thing is to role model in our own lives as best we can. And, none of us are perfect. I'm definitely not perfect. But it's not about beating ourselves up for our shortcomings. It's not about letting ourselves off the hook either. Why do small-scale actions matter when it's also global and systemic? It's because by doing the journey ourselves as best we can, we not only model it and inspire others, but we also learn about what that process is, because the micro process that goes on within us, all our own conflicts, are so parallel to the macro process of what it takes for the world to sort itself out. We need to develop the thinking skills for the 21st century, things like big picture thinking, global empathy, joining things up, our critical thinking capacities. We need to develop those in ourselves and in each other as best we can. And the capacity to appreciate just the beautiful world that we're in without having to get our kicks out of doing things that have high impacts. We need to ask ourselves the question, how else do we influence? So just to start with money, every time we spend or invest money, we're pushing for one future or another. And it's brilliant to see Triodos here being really clear about that. And in my small business, I've just gone through the exercise of trying to make sure all our pension schemes have got no fossil fuel in them. You wouldn't believe what a big exercise that was. It took somebody a week of their time digging around and checking what people were really saying and did it stack up. And it's an incredibly difficult business. And if you run a small business, you have to have pension schemes. Unless you're fanatical about it, it's bound to be stacked full of fossil fuel. Well, we need all that to change. We need to get better at insisting. We've had decades of asking nicely. We need to get better at insisting now. In terms of politicians, it's fashionable to say, oh yeah, climate change is so important, isn't it? We need 1.5 degrees. Actually, what we need to be doing is saying to anyone who says that, well, okay, let's have a look at everything else you say when you're not talking about climate change. And let's have a look at the coherence. Let's push and ask how coherent all of that is. And if it's not coherent, we need to get much better at saying, all right then, is it that you didn't spot that these two things didn't stack up against each other? Or is it that you hoped we wouldn't spot that they didn't stack up against each other? Because either way, and then we need to give people plenty of room to go away and change their minds. We need to get better at allowing people to change their minds, because we all need to do plenty of that. And finally, and I don't say this lightly, we've had decades of asking nicely, and it absolutely has to be time to protest now. And that protesting has to be done in a really thoughtful and clever way, because it needs to be effective, and because we need that change now. And I don't want to pin everything on Extinction Rebellion, but I will just say that I am very impressed with the way they're going about things, to the point that if anybody does want to buy one of my books today, there are £10 and £5 from that will go to Extinction Rebellion.